I'm Andy Kesson, and this is A Bit Lit. Founded at the beginning of the UK lockdown, A Bit Lit is about conversation, celebrating and exploring theatre, literature and creative work across all periods and of all kinds. We've talked to professional wrestlers and about Ghostbusters and medieval sex positivity. We've looked at the histories of race, gender and sexuality. We followed migrating coconuts and the history of wine and cheese. We've gone from Jane Austen and Shakespeare to EastEnders via the history of early television, young adult fiction, photography, animation and documentary making. And with over 100 films already, many other subjects as well. Join the conversations at our website, abitlit.co, or on YouTube, and follow us on Twitter at abitlit. Samira, hi, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
Good, really good of you to join us. We're starting our films by asking contributors to introduce themselves and to tell us a bit about what they do. So would you mind doing that, please?
So I'm Samira Ahmed. I'm a journalist. I guess these days people think of me primarily as a cultural and arts journalist because I present Front Row, which is Radio 4's flagship daily arts show, where we do everything from reviews to interviewing writers, directors, filmmakers, and having discussions about things. I might just as well be interviewing the culture secretary about what's happening with performing artists' possibilities for visa-free work travel as interviewing Margaret Atwood about her latest novel or her latest book of poems. I also make documentaries, a lot of which are very cultural. So I made Art of Persia, which was a kind of cultural history of the Iranian plateau and all the empires and all the kind of archaeological heritage and how it's shaped modern Iranian identity, including through poetry and literature and painting. And I'm also a news journalist, which is how I started out. I was a news trainee at the BBC, straight from university, after having done an English literature degree. And I loved news, and that was where I always thought I'd be. I worked as a foreign correspondent for a while in Los Angeles, I'd cover things like the Oscars, but I'd also cover the O.J. Simpson civil case where he was accused of murdering his ex-partner and her friend. And so there was often a juxtaposition of talking about kind of culture and popular culture, entertainment and hard news. And I thought it was quite important to know where those lines are. And sometimes the story is at heart, it's about domestic violence. It doesn't matter that the person accused is a celebrity sports person. It matters that the issue is domestic violence. And so that's how I've always approached my work, is through a hard news journalistic prism. I've done a lot of court reporting as well. The only encounter I ever had with Madonna was sitting in a courtroom in Los Angeles where she was forced to give evidence in the trial of her stalker. So there was all these issues about how women are forced to give their abusers the attention that they demand. But also her case flagged up the issue of stalking, which affects many ordinary women and men, not just celebrities. So again, I'm really interested about how hard news, politics and cultural sort of interweave and overlap. And I also present a show called Newswatch, where viewers complain about BBC news coverage and offer compliments, and we interview the newsmakers. So again, it's all critical thinking. It's all kind of like art appreciation. Was this a good news program? If not, why not? Why did they use that language? Was it appropriate? So the skills are all the same. And I also really love reading, writing, going to the cinema, theatre, and it's a huge part of my life and my work. And I'm also writing my first book, which is non-fiction, but it's about popular culture, and it's kind of historical and political.
Thank you. Are we allowed to hear more about the book? You were
No, sadly not.
Oh, okay.
I'm just getting on with it. But I spent a lot of October, November in the Bodleian Library in Oxford researching some diaries and papers which haven't been read before. So some really interesting stuff coming up, but I've got to get it all down and then you'll all know about it.
Fair enough. We all look forward to that. Thank you. That's really exciting. You talked about all of those things being very connected for you, but they also feel terrifyingly disparate for someone like me who just kind of does one thing. So I'm kind of fascinated to think about that connection between the hard news prism that you were talking about and then of the way much of this hard news gets consumed as entertainment. We're sort of in this weird moment maybe culturally where we're consuming even what we might call hard news as a kind of form of entertainment. Could you tell us a bit more about those challenges of the crossover?
Yes. So there's two issues there, and I'll park one of them, which is how you can report cultural news, like a celebrity interview, and actually create good news or important news out of it. But I think the issue you're flagging up most, and I'm happy to talk about first, is how we've kind of turned news into entertainment. And the term infotainment is the one that I often use, which was coined a few years ago. And an example would be, and I really noticed this in the early 2000s when I was a reporter at Channel 4 News for 11 years. And I used to have a lot of freedom to pursue my own stories, my own angles and more time. And there were all these Islamist protests, and they were obviously attention seeking and trying to provoke a distasteful reaction. You know, they would protest when bodies were being brought back from Iraq and Afghanistan. And cause distress, and they held up placards outside the Danish embassy, you know, calling about beheading the unbelievers, and some of them were eventually jailed for, you know, terrorist offences and incitement to murder. And there was one guy in particular, Anjem Chowdhury, who I'd encountered back when I was a reporter on Newsnight in the early 90s, who was stirring up trouble on university campuses, a lot of it anti-Semitic, but also anti-female, misogynistic, and just, you know, stirring up hostility, attacking strict enough Muslims, and you know they were getting away with a lot of harassment. And he would be invited on. I mean, it got to he'd be invited onto news programs. So I remember there was it was on News Watch. You know, Newsnight invited him on to discuss one of these controversial issues, and you know he was one of those people who, not even just there were ones who denied. You know, they questioned 9/11, for example, and you'd end up with a news interview where the presenter would be interviewing someone about their conspiracy theory. And of course, it fed more hostility. Ordinary Muslims felt this did nothing to help them remind people that this is an extremist view. And it wasn't until he was jailed on terrorist-related charges that actually news organisations suddenly thought, why were we just inviting him on as if he was just another voice to hear? And that's the infotainment issue. Now, what's really interesting is I thought that would be the end of it. But of course, it's come back in a different way, came back with climate change in a huge way where there was false equivalence, although that isn't entertainment so much. But I would argue in its own way, I'm going to think carefully about examples. I think the way news coverage around the royal family is used, and particularly when it's combined with rolling news, endless, like we're outside the hospital where some member of the royal family is about to give birth. Sometimes there's a jokey element. I know a couple of BBC presenters have become quite famous for like, oh, I'm really excited by this. But that's also about turning it into entertainment. And I think the phenomenon of rolling news in particular has, and then social media now on top of that, has really added to this sense that everything is only as exciting as, you know, the next stunt or the next explosive confrontation. And that's, I think, not healthy for a society, which we should know how to prioritise what is important and what isn't. And the pandemic has further fueled that, where the odd celebrity stunt or a feel-good story, or the clap for carers is a great example, where it took on a momentum of its own. And you ended up with crowds defying social distancing, crowding onto the bridge along with all those police officers. And people thought, you know, this has become a spectacle, and it's lost connection to the actual news event it was supposed to be about, which is the underfunding of the NHS and the heroic actions of staff who are at higher risk of death and infection, all the rest of it.
Yeah, thank you. You've given us lots of different ways of thinking about that issue. And I also wonder if Trump and Brexit are there too as examples of winning political power by being more entertaining than your rivals and by driving some of those cycles.
Yeah, well, I think it's also important to remember that although there's a lot of danger that Britain is heading that way, American news media is already at such an extreme, and it's hugely responsible for the kind of polarization of views in America. So their live news channels really just react to the next outrageous thing he would tweet. And there is that sense that you don't finish dealing with one before the next one comes along. And I remember the early days after he got elected, CNN had a debate and they put up a strapline, and the strapline said, alt-right founder asks, are Jews people? And quite rightly, a lot of people complained and said, why are you normalizing even the wording of that question? Why is this even up for debate? So I think that's been a big problem. And it's happened here, it's happened with Brexit, it's happened with a lot of issues. And I think it works to the advantage of some politicians as well, to keep they're constantly poking a fire of outrage, because it's a great distraction from underlying issues.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. A lot of my work is on the 16th century literary and theatrical culture, and there's a play in the 16th century in which a wannabe courtier is trained how to be a cool courtier, how to be a cool politician, by being trained to ask the question, "What news?" as the way of saying, "How are you?" because it's the way of getting all the gossip out of somebody.
That's brilliant. Which play is this?
It's called Sappho and Fao, or Fao, depending on how you pronounce it, by someone called John Lilly. But yeah, I taught thee that lesson to ask what news, says one courtier to another, and starts training him up to remember to ask that question in order to both entertain and to find out what is new.
Yeah, and it feeds the sense of, of there has to be action.
Yeah, absolutely. And it feels like, I mean, you mentioned rolling news as something that's happened in the last 30 years, I suppose, as a recent thing, but it's sort of built into the word news, isn't it? That it's all about this craving of the latest thing, the most recent thing, this kind of topicality of news.
Yeah, and it's funny. I remember reading a book that was a history of the 18th century a few years ago. I was interviewing the author for Night Waves, as it was then called, the Radio 3 Arts and Discussions program. It's now called Free Thinking. And, the 18th century London was this explosion of news media, all the different competing journals and papers, and they were being hawked around, and people were going to coffee houses to share them. And women were getting more literate. And, it seemed like it was in its own way as dynamic and as news obsessed as today. So I'm not trying to pretend that it's a uniquely modern phenomenon. However, I do think it unfolding in non-stop real time, where stuff is constantly in your face, and of course it's visual. We all know visual memory works in a more powerful way than the act of reading itself, although it's technically visual. There's a processing that goes on, and I think that's my concern. It's the sort of sensory overload, and it's easy for me to say because I'm older. I'm a Gen Xer. My generation grew up with new technologies coming in gradually, so we were all started out as readers, and smartphones in particular were not normal until we were well into adulthood. And I think it's very different when I see toddlers on planes being given iPads to watch and scroll through. And I can't help wondering what that does to concentration and their ability to process news and facts. And I think, coming back to the critical thinking skills that in theory you learn at school, but many humanities degrees reinforce, which is looking at a document or a piece of evidence and working out how reliable is this, what are its sources, does it have a bias? Now, we did that with physical documents, when you studied history or you read in a text, what anti-Semitism was there in Shakespeare's time that makes The Merchant of Venice entertaining and fun when in some ways it horrifies us today. It's much harder, weirdly, to do that, even though it's much easier to do that on the internet because you can quickly source things. But we know that lies and things get escalated far more quickly too. So it's a strange paradox of how the information network has actually created a greater sense of disinformation now.
Yeah, and there's a kind of liveness to social media, isn't there, as well? And social media makes agents of us all as journalists. Like I could go out and film something and it could quite quickly be picked up by the media in a way that would not have been possible in the 18th century. So it's
which is in some ways empowering. So I was an early adopter, relatively early adopter of Twitter, 2010. Maybe that wasn't that early. But what I really valued from very early on was that it was two-way. So it wasn't about talking down to people. It was actually getting hints. So sometimes we saw that unfold with the raid on the Osama bin Laden compound, where a local resident was woken up by the helicopters. That was the first news that something was going on. So there is a democratizing of events. Obviously, people can then lie and distort, but on the whole, I think there's been something very powerfully positive about individuals being able to come out, individuals becoming heroes because of what they've done, capturing incidents on camera and exposing whether it's racists or violent attacks. I think those are all the upsides. And then also getting in touch with people, approaching people for interviews, people suggesting topics to me. I've discovered so much through the openness of social media.
That's fascinating. Thank you, Samira. Is it all right to turn, we're talking about kind of the general landscape of the world you work in. If it's all right to turn to your work more specifically, the thing I saw from you most recently is the art of Persia, which is just fantastic. And is a lovely example of bringing new audiences to a cultural history which is just deeply marginalized in kind of traditional Western ways of thinking about history and art. Would you mind telling us both about the opportunities and the challenges of making a show like that?
Yeah, no, thank you for asking about it. What's been lovely about that show is I've had such amazing reaction from around the world. It's been shown in, I think, Portugal, Belgium, and a couple of other countries. And people have just grasped that understanding a culture is different to the news headlines and a regime in power. And I'm not going to, it wasn't a program about the Iranian regime. And I think it's helpful to know, because sometimes the last 40 years is a lifetime for many of us. I was 10 when the Iranian Revolution happened. So it's not to try and diminish just what tough time it's been, but it's also, when you put things into historical context, to appreciate that a cultural identity, especially one that feels under siege or under repression, can find great strength from knowing its historical depth. And what we discovered in making Art of Persia was that the Iranian plateau has been repeatedly invaded from east and from west, and yet somehow it's always held on to its language and its sense of self. And understanding that, I think, can only be enriching. It doesn't provide easy answers to where are we now, what are the prospects of the future, but it helps us understand Iranian people and that they are not the same as their government. I also found myself thinking a lot about, I grew up studying German. I did German A-level, and the wall came down when I was 21. So it was a huge event in my, early adulthood. And I remember that, it seemed East Germany would last forever when I was a child. The Cold War was this constant presence. And it was 40 years, pretty much the same when that ended. And it just reminded me how stuff can dramatically rupture. When I interviewed Michael Palin for my podcast, How I Found My Voice, he's writing history books these days. And I asked him if that gave him a different perspective. And he said even things like Brexit, which has divided the country so much and has been so angry an issue, he said, you can see in it's not to diminish the suffering and the anxiety about issues like Brexit or even the pandemic, I think, which was yet to come. But it kind of puts things into perspective, that in the grand timeline of human existence, this too shall pass. And I as I say, it's not to diminish it, but just to appreciate that time moves on and things become the past, and we learn to adapt and to cope. So I think that was all part of what came out of going to Persia. There was also, the significance of the fact that letting us in seemed to be an interesting, potentially culturally diplomatic thing. Scholars, and there are many archaeologists, who really would love to go and spend more time there. They're very hopeful that in the long term, Iran opening up to a two-way exchange with scholars is again a positive thing. It's how we start to understand each other. The cultural heritage waiting to be excavated there is just incredible, and then loans of objects and things. So again, that's a longer term process, but that's all important too. So I was glad to get in. We were given permission to go wherever we liked. We had a drone camera flying around at a time when the Iranian military was shooting down a US drone over the Strait of Hormuz, and it's sort of escalated tensions. Trump was threatening to bomb all these UNESCO heritage sites where we were filming. There are, I think, 22, probably more, UNESCO heritage sites in Iran alone. And just reminding people that Iran isn't just the country that you see in the news headlines, but it's one of the most culturally precious sites of human civilization. It was important.
Yeah, absolutely. Did that context, that what felt like at the time like a potential build up to war, did that affect the filming process at all?
No, what was interesting is, the BBC and a lot of Western media are blocked in a lot of Iran. So, but by sheer coincidence, just after we'd filmed with the drone, we got to Tehran, and we were staying at this hotel, which is where all the international diplomats stay. So it's the one hotel where it's got CNN and it's got BBC and it's got all the news services are not blocked there. So we suddenly caught up on all this stuff that was escalating, and it was interesting. The other thing we saw was there's some very witty billboards that are put up by the regime, and you just see them in the middle of the street as you're driving through towns. And there was one which was after the drone incident. It was like a video game, and it had like a missile shooting down a US plane, and it said, USA 0, Iran 1. And there was the one which is just a picture of Donald Trump with a big piece of black tape across his face, and it just said, shut up. So, you caught interesting glimpses into how how things looked in Iran. And, you know, they are an incredibly educated people. A lot of them have international connections. So news does get in. But the reality of living under a regime like that is people, and only people have a living memory of the Cold War and know people who were dissidents in Poland and East Germany and, you know, Soviet Russia can really understand how an entire population can live for decades or more with this sort of constant double level of what you feel safe to say out loud and what you feel safe to think. And, you know, we take it for granted that we have pretty much freedom of expression in countries like the UK, but it's a precious thing and it doesn't exist in many other places. And we're seeing it being turned back in places like Hong Kong right now in real time.
Absolutely, yes. And it felt like the programme was quite deliberately making us think about culture then and now, in that there were quite a lot of shots. The filming emphasised your journey to and from the spaces that the programme was covering. So it was thinking quite carefully about what Iran feels like from the street, I suppose, now, as well as the historical subject matter of the programme. I don't know if I got that right.
Yeah, well, part of it is because, I mean, Iran has so many things that are unique and they've held on to. So the bazaar culture of shopping, you know, it is different. They don't have malls. So there's one or two in North Tehran where the kind of, you know, elite go. But otherwise, the whole way it transacts its daily life is rooted in really ancient traditions. When you walk through the bazaar where Marco Polo walked through in Yazd, for example, and it's still a living bazaar, you know, you realise that connection is alive at a far more fundamental level than it is somewhere like Britain, where we say we're a nation of shopkeepers, but you know, not when Napoleon said that, who knows? But you know, it's not the same. It's just so. I think we wanted to see how much that ran at a deep level in Iranian identity could be traced back. So that was why the literature of the Shahnameh, which is the Persian Book of Kings, which I always describe as a combination of the Arthuriad, Shakespeare's history plays, and what's the third thing I'd say? I mean, and sort of a Greek myth, really, because it's mythology, but it's also, I mean, the poet who wrote it was looking at all these ancient relics of these lost ancient empires that he didn't understand. He didn't speak or read cuneiform. So he made up stories about real historical figures. And then at some point it turns into real history. That Iranians often have a copy of that at home. They learn the stories at school. It's far more alive to them than I would argue Shakespeare is. I think people may have heard of Shakespeare, but I don't think that many of us really would say they know their plays and their characters inside out. And if you imagine somewhere like Tintagel, where we think of it as the birthplace of King Arthur, that's the closest you've got to some of these locations like Persepolis, which is known as the kind of the throne of Jamshid, who was a mythological king. Because that was how it was described in this poem. So it has two names. So Iranians know that it's not like we know King Arthur probably didn't exist. But Tintagel is both Arthur's birthplace, but it's also a monastery that had a real history. That's how Iranians themselves.
Thank you. We're speaking in the week that a film company has threatened to release an Arthur film which is faithful to the original, which has blown my mind as a concept. And you're making me wonder what our shared stories are, because we don't really have, as you say, culturally Shakespeare's shared knowledge or even perhaps religious shared stories anymore. I'm beginning to worry that it's the kind of origin of superheroes that are maybe the closest that we have in our current culture to stories that we all share.
I mean, there are so many. I mean, I didn't know many. I knew a few Welsh legends growing up, and I read a lot of books of British myths and legends and fairy stories. So on the one hand, we needed to broaden that anyway. I mean, my husband's heritage is from Northern Ireland, and there are all these amazing Irish legends, about their kings and so on. So learning that is an additional thing we should all do. But King Arthur could be. I mean, there is this perpetual fascination with King Arthur, which I've read so many versions of it. I was rereading The Mists of Avalon, which is a feminist retelling, where Arthur is a rather weak man he's basically representing the Taliban, who are trying to destroy the true faith of ancient Britain, and Morgan Le Fay is trying to defend it. And I just wrote a column for a magazine about it, because that book changed the way I saw so much in life. And so, stories like that can help us. Well, it's really useful now, isn't it? Where, how do we define ourselves as Brits? What is our national story? You can even look at, you think no one disagrees that King Arthur's a great English story. whether it's British or not, it's also disputed now with greater kind of regional nationality.
Yeah.
But there are different ways of reading all of them, which I think, reveals that it's really hard to simplify it. I don't think we have that. And when you try to, like in the American myth, and I've made a program about the author of the Little House on the Prairie books, one of my documentaries is about Laura Ingalls Wilder, this whole myth of manifest destiny, that, white Christians were destined to just conquer the land from east to west. All the genocide of the Native Americans, they've never really processed that. Slavery, in the fundamentals of the birth of that, republic. They've never really dealt. There's still this great myth that America is founded on freedom, but it's not.
Absolutely, and Arthur intersects with all that, doesn't he? In that, as you say, that weird place where he's sort of English, sort of British. Sort of figure who fights off incoming migrants, and is also a kind of incoming migrant of his own. He sits in lots of odd places, and his story often comes from Europe and from Ireland rather than from kind of English sources as well. So circulating in lots of really
And the other thing is I studied Anglo Saxon at university. One of the joys of my English literature degree was it was still compulsory in the first year. And it was tough old English, but oh my God, how haunting is the world of the Anglo-Saxons, the real Anglo-Saxons, who of course were invaders, who came from flipping Germany and places like that. And so it's so interesting the way Anglo-Saxon has become shorthand for some white nationalists, when for me, the phrase Anglo-Saxon always makes you think of this lost, quite mournful culture with a real sense of death. And I don't know if you saw the British Library's exhibition of Anglo-Saxon kingdom about 3 or 4 years ago. It's one of the most moving experiences I've had in my life, because there's so much about, it's almost like an alien civilization which somehow disappeared, even though we think it's the root of us. So I'm quite fascinated by what we can learn from the older versions of ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely, me too. And whether they think of themselves as Angles or Saxons or something else as well really came out from that exhibition. I think these different stories that those various different kinds of people were telling about themselves. Samira, if it's all right to turn again to the kind of wider picture of your work, and where I both kind of fall over with astonishment at the different things balls you keep juggling, but also with total horror at the thought of it, because I'm a lazy person. It strikes me that one of the many things that's really striking about your career is you're doing both very long-term projects like a big TV show, you're writing a book, and yet you also are very committed to repeat broadcasting, to being there every week discussing and responding to recent issues and the way that they've been presented and responding to viewer feedback. Do you mind telling us a little bit about what it is like to move between those two different kinds of ways of working?
I think it's not uncommon with journalists who started out in hard news. As you get older and you have more experience, you've kind of covered all those stories before. So I still have friends who I started out at the BBC with who were still daily news reporters, like Duncan Kennedy, who's outside court doing court reports. There is still a satisfaction in doing a specific job well. And I would often tell people there was nothing like pleasure's a strange word, but being in court where it's just you paying attention to what everyone's saying, writing down, sifting them and working out what are the key points here. And the workings of, I've only seen the English justice system. I haven't been in Scottish or Welsh or Northern Irish courts, but there's something about the workings of our justice system which are actually incredible. And I really urge people to just go and sit and watch them, because it's masterclass in the power of carefully made arguments and evidence and the good work that so many decent police officers and officials do for us. So that was really powerful, and it's often informed my work. So when I've interviewed crime writers, for example, I've just sometimes thought, why have you written a made-up book about serial killer? I've sat in a room with a serial rapist, and I don't understand why people want to create fictional ones when I like to understand what makes real ones and how we stop it. And growing into long form happened gradually. So at Channel 4 News, I would turn around daily news pieces, but I also had the chance to work on my own films, and that's where I really started to make more cultural focused things. So I interviewed. We would get interviews with directors. So we got Tim Burton when he made Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. But because we had a decent time slot, I could talk to him about his backstory and what had inspired some of his earlier films. So that became sort of middle form journalism. And then I think I went freelance about 10 years ago. And I think it's just partly the confidence of having done things for years. I'd already made a documentary series at Channel 4 and been to Iran for that. there's different, you have different levels of focus, I think. I find it harder to do super long form stuff. With the documentary, it's a team. So a lot of the work of that was others having to sort out the logistics. We had an amazing team of local fixers who organised our locations and our accommodation. So I could focus. I remember reading the Shahnameh, you know, pretty much cover to cover during that trip, which is 66,000 lines of poetry in English, I should say. But I could dive into that and kind of absorb the sense of what the poem represented and then match it to individual locations where I would respond with my journalistic instincts to what I saw. And some of that was spotting, like I would spot a turtle in the water and would make sure we filmed it. But some of it was responding just to something someone said to me or something I'd just seen. And a lot of that came across in the pieces of camera I did. So I think they all fit together a bit like a mosaic. And I mean, with writing a book, I mean, I'm relatively early in it, but I have done all my research. There was something about going back to my student days. And I would say the skills, you know, for those of you as students that you learn at A-level and degree level of diving into the subject that fascinates you. And, you know, phone off in the library, because I used to have to drive to Oxford to do it. I used to be in the library from 9 till 7 and just maximize my time. And I was going through original documents and just unfolding history. So I would come out each day, and you know, that year I might have been in 1977 that day. Then I would re-emerge into what was happening on the news on my way home. And I quite like that. I guess I've become more of a historian in a way. And I think journalists make natural historians from the day-to-day turnaround to when you get older. I can remember what the 80s were like, and I can compare it to the mass unemployment and the effect on young people happening today. Although it's different, there are similarities. So straight away, you become a historian anyway as an older journalist, and that then becomes a skill you can translate into. The research is the same, it's just longer form.
Yeah. Thank you. We're nearing the end of the film, Samira. I'm absolutely delighted from a professional point of view that you're ending it by selling university study. Thank you very much. I can feel my employer getting very excited about that. We end our films by asking what the word literature means to you, and you're welcome to answer this as professionally or as personally as you like. And you've already given us quite a few clues, I think. But yeah, where does that word sit for you as a word?
I don't overthink it. I love reading books, and I love comics as well, which are not you know, I wouldn't consider kind of literature in the same way, but I think culturally they're incredibly valuable. And I read them as much as I read, you know, T.H. White's A Sword in the Stone or Jane Eyre or any of those other books. It's been my biggest comfort. What's been interesting during the pandemic is, you know, with everyone's time changed and how much time they had changed. And since well, it's been a year now, I wake up at 6, which I've started to do anyway as I was getting older. I read for 2 hours, and sometimes I have a book to read for work, a new novel. So some of that is the joy of being given stuff that I haven't chosen. So I'm reading widely. But there's so many things that I haven't yet read. I mean, I love Balzac, for instance, a French novelist who wrote about the early 19th century. And I read this book about the kind of hack journalists of early 19th century Paris. And it's funny because it's a completely different world, and yet you see the similarities, and it's a world of the theatre and harlots and corruption. And I just love the escape. And I also love the stuff that has unexpected resonances. So that means a lot. So Octavia Butler, the African-American science fiction writer, I mean, she was writing these amazing books about a right-wing, rabble-rousing president who wanted to make America great again. She wrote that book in the early 90s. And she wrote about slavery in a time travel book called Kindred. And those books have got a new resonance again. So I found comfort. I've been challenged. But if you saw my house, I think I love books more than people. No, that's not true. I do love my children, but they mean everything to me. They've always been a comfort, and they're an escape too, and they're an entertainment. So
I love that.
There's no joy like it.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm currently rereading Octavia Butler as well, and I completely agree with you about how terrifyingly she predicts our current moment.
Yeah, Parable of the Sower and Parable of the what's the other one? Talents. Yeah.
Yes, and loving books more than people. I'm pleased my husband isn't here as we're having this film, because I think he lives with someone who he worries feels the same way as more books coming.
Well, you probably won't want to include this, but you know what John Waters said about, because he said two things about books. One is the joy of success was being able to buy any book like a hardback without having to ask the price. But the other thing he said, and apologies for the language, you can always take this out, is if you meet someone and you go to their home and they don't have any books, don't fuck them. That was his personal opinion. I think he said, don't fuck them.
Samira, it's been an absolute joy to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy. And I would say to anyone watching this, either they're watching it when there's still effects of the pandemic, in which case, as we now know, this too shall pass, or they're watching this as a historical relic and an artifact from the past, and they're trying to make sense of why were they all talking about this thing that happened, which lasted for only a year?
Absolutely. Yeah, we like to think of the Bit Lit as a sort of time capsule for our moment, and it will only be a few years' time people will be watching thinking, why are they all at home? But here we are. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.